Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. Today, we are going to be tackling something that you guys sent to us, and it's super interesting.
Oh, yeah.
We are going to be trying to figure out what Jeremy Boring really thinks about Brett Cooper.
Ooh, yeah. That is a really juicy one. So Brett Cooper, she left the comment section a little while back.
It made some waves online.
Oh, it did, for sure.
Yep.
The viewership dipped.
Yeah.
A lot of people talking about it.
Yeah, and there's this interesting thing where Jeremy Boring hasn't actually directly addressed it.
Yeah, he's been really quiet.
So that kind of begs the question.
Yeah.
Can we figure out what he thinks based on what he has said and done?
Yeah, like what can we extrapolate from the information that we do have?
Yeah, exactly. So you sent me a bunch of really cool stuff, clips, articles, comments, kind of the whole 9 yards.
Yeah, tried to give you a good spread to work with.
And one of the most interesting places to start, I think, is with Candace Owens,
Oh, for sure.
because she's worked with both of them at the Daily Wire.
Right, she's got a really unique perspective.
Exactly. And in this clip you sent me, she really doesn't hold back.
Okay.
She claims there's this deliberate effort to hurt Brett's reputation before she launches her own thing.
Oh, wow. That's a bold statement.
Yeah. So what evidence does she have?
Well, that's what I'm curious about.
Yeah, so she points to a couple of articles, one in the Hollywood Reporter, one in the Spectator, and she basically argues that both of them focus really heavily on Brett's social media activity,
Interesting.
almost like trying to paint her in a negative light.
Like they're trying to set a narrative.
Yeah, and she even mentions how journalists were reaching out to her, asking all these questions about Brett,
Really?
trying to connect her to some of the controversies that Candace herself has been involved with.
Oh, wow. So they're really trying to dig up dirt.
It seems like it.
Ah,
And you can really hear the frustration in Candace's voice when she's talking about it.
yeah, I bet.
She even compares it to her own experience when she left the Daily Wire.
Interesting.
So it's like, is this a pattern?
Right. Is this like a standard operating procedure?
right, exactly.
At the Daily Wire.
Now, it is important to say that Candace doesn't specifically say that the Daily Wire is behind this, quote, smear campaign.
Right.
She specifically mentions those two publications.
Right.
But it definitely adds another layer of intrigue to all this.
Oh, absolutely. Because it makes you wonder, who is behind this?
Right.
Is it just like a couple of rogue journalists, or is there something more coordinated going on?
Right. And if there is something more coordinated, who benefits from that?
Exactly.
Okay. So you also sent me a video of Jeremy Boring where he does address the situation,
Oh, okay.
but in a roundabout way.
Okay.
This is his response to the backlash that Reagan Conrad got, who replaced Brett Cooper.
Oh, right. When the
Thanks.
comment section had its first show with Reagan?
Yeah, exactly. So people had a lot of thoughts about that.
It did.
And Boring, made this video response.
Okay.
And what's really fascinating is that while he's defending Reagan, he says some stuff about Brett Cooper that I think is very telling.
Yeah. It's like what he says when he's talking about Brett Cooper. That's actually the most revealing.
Okay, so let's break it down. He starts out by saying that Brett's super talented.
Okay.
He calls her tremendously talented.
All right.
But then he immediately pivots
Yeah.
and is like, well, the comment section success isn't just because of her.
Okay.
He talks about the Daily Wire's marketing
Mm-hmm.
and the work that Reagan did behind the scenes as a producer.
Okay, so he's kind of spreading the credit around.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, she's talented, but let's not forget about everybody else.
Right.
And then he goes on to mention sending Brett to acting and dancing and singing lessons
Oh, really?
as to support her artistic aspirations.
Right. To help her broaden her skills.
Exactly. But I think a lot of people have pointed out that this could also be interpreted as a little bit of a backhanded compliment.
Oh, interesting. How so?
Well, it's almost like he's implying that she needed all this extra help in order to really shine.
Oh, I see what you mean.
If she was already so great, why did she need all these extra lessons?
Right. It's like he's praising her, but also kind of taking a dig at her at the same time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, what's the intention behind that?
Yeah. What is he really trying to communicate here?
Right. Is he intentionally trying to, undermine Brett?
Right.
Or is this just him awkwardly trying to defend his company's decision to replace her?
Yeah. It's a tough situation to be in, for sure.
Yeah. And then on top of that, he goes on to say that the audience loved Reagan when she guest hosted,
Okay.
and that all this criticism that she's getting is unfair.
Hmm.
And it's all part of this narrative against the Daily Wire.
So he's basically shifting the blame away from the show itself.
Yeah.
And towards these external forces.
Yeah, it's like, don't blame Reagan, blame the haters.
Right. Create this us versus them mentality.
But he's also conveniently leaving out the part where, Brett was really instrumental in establishing what the comment section was.
Right. And connecting with the audience.
Yeah, exactly.
So it's like he's trying to rewrite history a little bit.
Yeah, and make this transition to a new host seem smoother than it actually was.
Right. Make it seem like it's not that big of a deal that Brett's gone.
Okay, so we've got Candace Owens talking about this maybe smear campaign.
Right.
And we've got Jeremy Boring making these, like, interestingly worded comments.
Yeah, very calculated.
So, of course, the internet had some thoughts.
Oh, I bet. The internet loves to chime in on this kind of stuff.
Yeah, you sent over this clip from The Quartering.
Yes.
And his analysis of Boring's video is, I think, really spot on.
Yeah, he's usually pretty good at breaking this stuff down.
He points out all those moments where it seems like Boring is trying to shade Brett, even if it's subtle.
Yeah, and I bet the comment section on his video is a goldmine.
Oh, it's amazing. I pulled out a couple of the top comments that I think really sum up the general sentiment.
Okay, let's hear them.
So this one says, the guy who made her sign an NDA wants her to speak about something she probably isn't even allowed to speak about.
Ooh, that's a good point.
And then this one, none of that explains why Brett unfollowed Reagan and Jeremy on all social media and why she deleted the maid of honor photos.
Okay, so there's clearly some bad blood there.
Yeah. And then this last one says, a good CEO doesn't go around talking about his feelings. Why does he publicly call out Brett? Can he not just call her up and explain the problem and ask her to say something?
So they're questioning his leadership style.
Yeah, like, why is he airing all this dirty laundry in public?
It's not a good look.
So it seems like the general consensus is that something's not adding up.
Yeah, there's definitely more to this story than meets the eye.
Yeah, people are picking up on this vibe that Boring is being kind of shady.
Right, and that he's trying to downplay Brett's contributions and shift the blame for the show's decline.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what makes this whole situation so fascinating.
It's like a real-life drama unfolding online.
We're not just analyzing what's being said, we're trying to understand what's not being said.
Right, those unspoken narratives, the subtle digs, the carefully crafted statements.
Okay, so before we dive into the next part of our analysis, I want to pose a question to you, our listener. What stands out to you so far?
What are your initial impressions of this whole situation?
What are you thinking?
We'll be back in a moment to explore another layer of this intriguing puzzle.
It's crazy how much you can read into what people don't say, right?
Oh, yeah, totally. Like, we're trying to figure out how Jeremy Boring feels about Brett Cooper, but he's giving us, like, nothing to work with directly.
Exactly. So we were talking about how the audience is picking up on these unspoken narratives, but I think there's another layer here that's worth looking at.
Okay, what's that?
Jeremy Boring's own worldview.
Oh, that's a good point.
Yeah.
Yeah, to really understand someone's, like, unspoken opinions, you gotta understand their values.
Right, exactly. And from everything I know about Boring, he seems to value authenticity, like, above all else.
Right. He's always talking about being true to yourself, not backing down from your beliefs.
Yeah, and, standing up for what you believe in, even when it's not popular.
Right. And he built the Daily Wire on that principle, right?
Exactly. So that's where I think it gets really interesting, because love her or hate her, Brett Cooper is someone who embodies that authenticity.
Oh, yeah, for sure. She's never been afraid to speak her mind.
She's not afraid to challenge the status quo.
Yep, she's definitely not afraid of controversy.
And she's willing to have those, like, really tough conversations that Boring seems to value so much.
Right. So she kind of fits the mold of what he seems to admire.
So is it possible that he actually admires her for those very qualities?
That's a good question. It's definitely possible. I mean, maybe he sees her as, like, a kindred spirit.
Yeah.
Someone who shares his passion for, like, truth-seeking and challenging conventional wisdom.
And maybe that's why he's so hesitant to actually criticize her directly, even when it seems like he's subtly undermining her.
Yeah, maybe he respects her too much to, like, really go after her in public.
Right. It's like he wants to defend his company's decision, but he also doesn't want to, like, totally burn that bridge with Brett.
Yeah, it's a delicate balance.
Like he's trying to walk this tightrope.
He is, for sure.
And it makes me think about another thing we talked about with Boring's communication style.
Okay.
His tendency towards passive aggressiveness.
Oh, yeah, that backhanded compliment about the acting, dancing, and singing lessons.
Right.
It's like he's saying one thing, but implying something totally different.
Exactly. And it's often used as a way to express negative feelings without actually having to confront the issue head on.
Right. It's like a way to get your digs in without being explicitly mean.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it can be effective, but it can also backfire spectacularly.
Especially when the audience picks up on those underlying messages.
And in this case, the audience is definitely picking up on
Oh,
it.
yeah, they are. They are reading between the lines.
Remember all those YouTube comments?
Yeah.
People calling Boring out for being shady, for trying to downplay Brett's contributions?
So it seems like his attempt at passive aggression might be having the opposite effect of what he intended.
Totally. Instead of subtly undermining Brett, he's actually highlighting her importance and making himself look worse in the process.
Yeah, it's like he's accidentally shining a spotlight on the very thing he's trying to downplay.
It's really a case study in how communication can be so easily misinterpreted,
Especially online.
especially in the age of social media where every word is scrutinized and analyzed.
Right, and it shows how important it is to consider the audience's perspective.
Yeah, totally. So now I want to go back to something you said earlier about Boring maybe admiring Brett for her authenticity.
Okay.
If we just entertain that idea for a second, it raises another question.
Okay, what's that?
Why not just come out and say it?
Oh, that's interesting. Like, why not explicitly acknowledge the things he admires about her?
Yeah.
Well, maybe he's trying to keep things professional.
Right.
Avoid getting too personal.
Maybe he feels like if he explicitly praises Brett, it'll make his defense of Reagan sound less genuine.
Right, like he's worried about appearing inconsistent.
Exactly. It's
Yeah.
like he's caught between these two competing narratives.
Yeah.
The narrative of the Daily Wire moving forward with a new host, and then this other narrative where he has to acknowledge Brett's contributions.
Right, he can't really fully embrace one without undermining the other.
And it seems like the way he's chosen to deal with that is through this really subtle, indirect way of communicating,
Yeah, but as we've seen, that approach can be pretty risky.
because it leaves so much room for interpretation.
And misinterpretation.
Exactly. Okay. So we've talked about Boring's values,
Right?
his tendency towards passive aggression, and the possibility that he might actually admire Brett more than he's letting on.
Right?
But there's one more piece of this puzzle we need to consider:
Okay, what's that?
the audience.
Oh, yeah. The viewers, the ones who ultimately decide whether a show succeeds or fails.
And in this case, the audience has been very vocal.
Yeah, they're not shy about sharing their opinions.
They miss Brett.
Yeah, it's pretty clear they're not happy about the change.
They're not buying what Boring's selling, at least not when it comes to the comment section.
And the numbers reflect that. Right?
Exactly. The viewership has taken a nosedive.
Which has got to sting a bit,
Right.
for Boring especially.
For Boring, who's built his career on challenging the mainstream and appealing to a very specific audience, to see that audience reject his chosen replacement,
That's got to be tough.
it's a huge blow to the ego.
It's a reminder that no matter how successful you are, you're still at the mercy of the audience.
And it makes you wonder, does Boring deep down regret how things went down with Brett?
Yeah, does he wish he had handled things differently?
It's impossible to know for sure,
We can't get inside his head.
but it's definitely something to think about.
Right.
It's like we're trying to read his mind, but there are all these layers of, obfuscation and strategic communication getting in the way.
Right, but that's what makes this whole analysis so fascinating.
Right. We're forced to really think critically.
Yeah.
Way different perspectives.
Consider the impact of both what's said and what's left unsaid.
Exactly. So before we move on to the final part of our deep dive, I want to ask you, our listener, what do you think is going through Jeremy Boring's mind?
What's your take on all of this?
It's like we're putting together this puzzle and a bunch of the pieces are missing.
Right. Like we can see these little hints that Boring respects Brett's talent.
Right.
Maybe even that he's frustrated or regrets how everything went down.
Yeah.
But it's all hidden behind this wall of he's being very strategic with how he's talking about it.
Right. And the audience is definitely picking up on that.
Oh, yeah, especially the comment section's core audience.
Right. They're reading into every word and every silence.
Trying to figure out what's going on.
Exactly. And this
Yeah.
brings up a really important point about communication, I think,
Okay.
especially now with everything being online.
Yeah, what you don't say can be just as important as what you do say.
It's like that elephant in the room.
Oh, yeah, totally. Everyone knows it's there, but nobody wants to talk about it.
Right. And when it's someone like Jeremy Boring, who's built his whole career on challenging narratives and speaking his mind,
Right.
it's even more noticeable when he's quiet.
It's almost like a contradiction.
Right. He's a super outspoken guy. But then when it comes to Brett Cooper, he's suddenly really careful about what he says.
Yeah, and that makes the audience think that he's trying to hide something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it creates this vacuum where all this speculation and interpretation can run wild.
And usually it's not positive speculation.
Right. It's usually pretty negative, and it creates this distrust.
Yeah, it makes people question his motives.
So going back to what Candace Owens was saying about that potential smear campaign against Brett,
Right.
she never actually says that it's Boring or the Daily Wire that's behind it.
Right.
But it makes you think about how powerful these unspoken narratives can be.
Yeah, even if there's no intentional effort to hurt Brett's reputation,
Right.
the way this whole situation has been handled, it's creating its own narrative.
Exactly. And that narrative, intentional or not, is really impacting how people see both Brett and Boring.
Oh, for sure. It's having real-world consequences.
And it makes you think about how even the smallest actions
Right.
or the tiniest changes in wording can have these huge ripple effects online.
It's like a butterfly effect.
Yeah. So now I want to turn it back to you, the listener. What do you think? Do you think what Jeremy Boring has said and done, especially the things he hasn't said, do you think that shows how he really feels about Brett Cooper?
Is there something more going on beneath the surface?
Maybe we'll never know the whole story.
Right.
But I think what we've learned from this deep dive is that sometimes the things that go unsaid are the most telling,
Yeah, it's a good reminder that communication is complicated.
especially online.
It's not just about the words you choose, but also about the silences you leave behind.
A lot of times those silences speak volumes.
They do.
Well, thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Yeah, this was a good one.
Keep asking questions and keep exploring these ideas, because sometimes the most interesting stories are the ones that leave the most room for interpretation.
That's the fun part.
Until next time.